Eleanor Whitmore had always thought of birthdays as sacred days, quiet markers of love, gratitude, and connection. In the early hours of the morning, she awoke to a room bathed in pale winter light. The curtains she had sewn herself many years ago swayed gently in the crisp air, seeping through a small gap in the window. The clock on her bedside table ticked softly, each movement a reminder that time was passing, just as it always had, 60 years. It felt like both a lifetime and a fleeting breath. Her first instinct, as with every birthday since her daughter Sabrina was born, was to reach for her phone. She imagined it vibrating with a heartfelt message or lighting up with a call. Instead, the screen was dark and silent. She tapped it once, then again, the faint light reflecting in her tired eyes. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no notification that her daughter had remembered. At first, she told herself there could be a reasonable explanation. Sabrina might be busy preparing something special. Perhaps she was still asleep or caught up with her two young children's morning chaos. Eleanor tried to cling to that hope, the same way she had clung to hope in the past when Sabrina's temper or coldness left her confused. She had raised Sabrina almost single-handedly, working double shifts at the small town library and taking side jobs cataloging old manuscripts for extra pay. Her ex-husband had left when Sabrina was barely 3, and Eleanor had made it her mission to fill both parental roles. Mother and father, comforter and provider, she had skipped vacations, postponed medical checkups, and gone without new clothes for years so her daughter could have ballet lessons, school trips, and a college education in the city. A fragile excitement began to fade into unease. Eleanor decided to call her daughter, if only to hear her voice and break the silence. She navigated to Sabrina's contact and pressed the green phone icon. The line didn't ring. Instead, a short, flat message appeared on the screen. "You've been blocked." At first, her mind refused to process it. She thought it was a glitch, a mistake, something that could be fixed with a restart. She tried again, this time through the messaging app. The message failed instantly, bouncing back with a sharp red exclamation mark. Her chest tightened as the reality settled in. Sabrina had deliberately shut her out, not just forgotten her birthday, but erased the possibility of reaching out. Eleanor placed the phone on the table with deliberate care, as if setting it down too quickly would cause it to shatter the fragile thread of composure she was holding on to. She stared at the faded family photograph on the mantelpiece across the room. Sabrina at age 10, missing a front tooth, but grinning widely, wearing the knitted sweater Eleanor had stayed up all night to finish. She could still remember the warmth of Sabrina's small hands back, then the way she would curl up next to her on the sofa during thunderstorms. How had that little girl become the woman who now saw her mother as disposable? Quietness of the house pressed in on her, each creak and groan of the old floorboards magnifying her sense of abandonment. She moved to the kitchen, seeking comfort in routine. The kettle whistled softly as she poured water into her favorite porcelain teapot, the one with tiny blue flowers along the rim. She brewed a strong cup of Earl Grey and took it to the kitchen window. Outside, the early morning frost coated the garden, transforming each blade of grass into a tiny crystal. The neighbor's dog barked somewhere in the distance, a cheerful sound that made the stillness inside feel even heavier. She sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. She thought about birthdays past, Sabrina calling from college with stories of new friends, Sabrina surprising her with a cake 1 year after work, Sabrina arriving unannounced with her children just 2 years ago, filling the house with laughter. But in the past year, things had shifted. Eleanor had noticed the subtle changes: shorter phone calls, postponed visits, a certain coldness when Sabrina's husband was around. There had been small disagreements, too, often over things Eleanor didn't think mattered. Her old-fashioned, way of talking, her comments about the children's manners, her reluctance to discuss selling the family home. She had dismissed them at the time, thinking that family bonds were stronger than passing irritations. Now, she wondered if those were early cracks in the foundation, signs she hadn't wanted to see. Her eyes drifted to the stack of mail on the sideboard, envelopes in various colors and sizes. She sifted through them absent-mindedly. Utility bills, a flyer from the local supermarket, a charity request. Then, at the very bottom, she noticed a thick, glossy flyer she hadn't paid much attention to when it arrived a week ago. It advertised a grand event at the Grand Orchard Hall, one of the most luxurious venues in town. The picture on the front showed a chandelier glittering above elegantly dressed guests, tables laden with flowers and champagne. The date caught her attention tonight. She knew instantly why it seemed familiar. Sabrina had once said that the Grand Orchid Hall was her dream venue for hosting parties, a place she hoped to book when the occasion is worth it. Eleanor's mind began to churn, not yet with plans, but with questions. Could it be that Sabrina was connected to this event? Was this why she had been blocked? The thought stung, but it also ignited something deep inside, an ember of curiosity mixed with the first flickers of defiance. She set the flyer aside and stood up, moving through the living room as if the simple act of walking could shake off the heaviness. Her cat, an old tabby named Oliver, patted over and rubbed against her leg. She bent down to stroke his fur, taking comfort in the soft, steady purr. Oliver had been with her for 12 years, his loyalty unshaken by mood or circumstance. She wished human hearts could be as steadfast. The hours of the morning stretched on. She tried reading, but the words on the page blurred. She attempted to water the plants in her conservatory, but her hands trembled slightly. The absence of a single phone call had become a roaring silence in her head, each minute confirming that this was no mistake, no delay, this was deliberate. By midday, the sun shone weakly through the clouds, casting long, pale stripes across the kitchen floor. Eleanor made herself a simple sandwich, but found she couldn't finish it. Instead, she sat again by the window, watching a pair of sparrows peck at the frozen ground. Her mind wandered to the sacrifices she had made over 6 decades of life. How many times she had swallowed her own pain to protect someone else. How many birthdays she had spent making others feel special while neglecting her own needs. She had never imagined that the one person she had poured her life into would be the one to leave her feeling unwanted on such a personal day. The bitterness of that realization mixed with an aching sadness, and for a moment, she let a tear slide down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as though afraid the walls might see her weakness. It was in that moment of quiet grief that the memory of the flyer returned to her mind with unusual clarity. She reached for it again, holding it between her fingers, examining every detail, the lavish table settings, the soft glow of candlelight, the gold embossed lettering. A voice inside her, one she had long ignored, whispered that she didn't have to accept this kind of dismissal. She didn't have to let her birthday be reduced to a wound she would quietly nurse in solitude. The thought startled her because Eleanor had never considered herself the vengeful type. But maybe it wasn't revenge she was thinking about. Maybe it was reclaiming a part of herself she had given away too freely for too long. She stood and walked to her small writing desk, opening the top drawer to retrieve her address book. Her fingers traced over familiar names, friends she hadn't seen in years, former colleagues, people she had once laughed with at community events. She thought of who might still be in town, who might remember her warmly. The act of flipping through those pages brought back flashes of a younger Eleanor, confident, determined, unafraid to take bold steps. For the rest of the afternoon, the air in the house felt different, charged with a subtle but growing energy. The pain was still there, but it no longer sat as heavily in her chest. It had shifted transforming into something sharper, more focused. She still didn't know the full truth about the event at the Grand Orchard Hall, but she had an unshakable feeling that she was about to find out. Evening shadows began to creep across the walls, and the streetlights outside flickered on. Eleanor boiled the kettle again, pouring herself another cup of tea. As she sipped, she allowed herself to imagine a scene she had never dared to before. One where she wasn't left out, where she wasn't the quiet afterthought in her own family story. She didn't know how yet, but something in her was stirring, something that would not be silenced. And as she set the empty cup down, she realized that today might still turn out to be a birthday worth remembering. Not because of what she had been given, but because of what she was about to take back. By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long amber lines across the tiled floor, Eleanor had almost convinced herself she could let the day pass quietly. She told herself she would make a warm dinner, perhaps watch an old film, and try to forget that her daughter's voice had not reached her ears. But deep down, that raw ache remained, pulsing quietly beneath every movement she made. It was while she was rinsing her teacup in the sink that she heard the soft creak of her front gate and the sound of hesitant footsteps on the porch. Oliver, her cat, lifted his head from his place on the armchair, ears twitching at the noise. A gentle knock followed. When Eleanor opened the door, she found herself looking at Margaret Lane, her neighbor of 20 years, bundled in a thick wool coat and clutching something in her gloved hands. Margaret's smile was warm but tinged with a hesitancy Eleanor couldn't quite place. "Happy birthday, Eleanor," she said softly, holding out a small box tied with silver ribbon. Eleanor smiled back, touched by the gesture, and stepped aside to let her in. The two women had been friendly for years, exchanging pies during the holidays, sharing plants in the spring, but rarely did they visit without warning. That alone made this afternoon unusual. As they moved into the living room, Eleanor noticed Margaret glancing down at the glossy envelope she carried along with the gift box. She seemed to be debating whether to hand it over or hide it away. Eleanor, ever perceptive, tilted her head slightly and asked, "What's that you've got there?" Margaret hesitated, then sighed, lowering herself into the armchair. She set the envelope on the coffee table, and it slid slightly, revealing a gleam of gold embossing. "It's an invitation," Margaret said finally, "to a gala at the Grand Orchard Hall tonight." She looked almost guilty as she continued, "I wasn't going to mention it, but then I realized you might already know about it." Eleanor's brows knitted. "A gala?" She echoed, the word tasting strange in her mouth. Margaret nodded, opening the envelope to reveal a thick, cream-colored card edged in gold foil. The lettering was elegant, curling in loops that spoke of wealth and deliberate luxury. The event was described as a birthday celebration and charity fundraiser, scheduled for that very evening, beginning with champagne at 7, followed by a formal dinner. Eleanor's eyes caught on a familiar name printed near the bottom of the invitation, just below the words, "hosted by." It was Sabrina's husband's family name, bold and undeniable. Her pulse quickened. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the connection. "I thought maybe you'd be going," she offered. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I didn't receive an invitation." Her voice was calm, but the weight of the words pressed hard in her chest. It was not just that she had been left out, it was that the exclusion had been so deliberate, so absolute, that her daughter hadn't even allowed for the possibility of her finding out. The blocking, the silence, now it all formed a single, ugly picture. Margaret bit her lip. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I debated whether to bring this at all, but I didn't want you to hear about it from someone else tomorrow and wonder why no one told you." Eleanor appreciated her honesty, though it felt like someone had just pressed a cold stone into her hands. She picked up the invitation, feeling its weight, running her fingers over the embossed letters. In her mind's eye, she saw the grand chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the glittering glasses of champagne. She could imagine Sabrina there, radiant in a silk dress, smiling for photos with her in-laws, basking in praise from people who barely knew her. And she could imagine herself, absent, erased, made irrelevant by the very child she had nurtured. The memory of every selfless act rose unbidden. She had stood in freezing winds to watch Sabrina in school plays, taken night shifts to pay for her university, and spent her savings helping with the down payment for Sabrina's first home. Yet now, on her own milestone birthday, she was not even worth a seat in the back of the room. The sting was not just personal, it was public. Everyone at that gala would see her absence, and draw their own conclusions. Margaret's voice broke into her thoughts. It's none of my business, of course. But if you want me to stay with you tonight, I can. We can watch something, drink wine. Eleanor offered a small, grateful smile, but her mind was already moving elsewhere. She couldn't explain it yet, even to herself, but something had shifted. There was a part of her. A part she thought had been buried under years of patience and quiet endurance that was stirring awake. She didn't want wine and distraction. She didn't want to sit quietly in her living room while her own daughter played hostess at a glittering event from which she had been so purposefully barred. I appreciate it, Margaret, she said gently, but I think I'll be all right. Really? Margaret nodded, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor with concern. She stayed a little longer, chatting about mundane neighborhood matters, perhaps to keep the atmosphere light. When she finally left, Eleanor stood at the window for a long moment, watching her cross the yard back to her own house. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. Inside her, however, there was no quiet, only the steady rise of a resolve she hadn't expected to feel. She walked back to the coffee table and picked up the invitation again. The gold letters gleamed under the lamplight, almost taunting her. She turned it over in her hands, studying the details, the RSVP line, the schedule, the note about formal attire. The very elegance of it seemed to mock her absence. And yet, rather than feeling crushed beneath its weight, she felt a slow, simmering heat in her chest. It was then that a realization crystallized. Sabrina had not simply forgotten her, had not made an accidental oversight. She had chosen, with clear intent, to exclude her own mother from an event held in their shared town on the very day of her mother's 60th birthday. It was an act so calculated that it could not be met with mere tears or quiet acceptance. Eleanor's mind drifted to a conversation she'd had nearly a decade ago with Howard Drake, an old friend from her library days. Howard had been a young entrepreneur then, struggling to keep his fledgling company afloat. She had helped him navigate legal paperwork, lending her meticulous eye to contracts and proofreading his business proposals without ever asking for payment. If you ever need anything, Eleanor, he had told her with a sincerity that stuck, you call me, I'll never forget what you did for me. Over the years, they'd exchanged holiday cards, brief phone calls, and the occasional lunch. He had always kept that promise in the air between them, like a debt uncollected. Her hand hovered over her phone for a moment before she picked it up. She didn't call Howard, not yet. Instead, she placed the invitation beside the flyer she'd kept from earlier, comparing the details. They matched perfectly: the same venue, the same date, the same time. This was no coincidence. Her daughter was at the center of it all. And that thought, while painful, also made her strangely clear-headed. For the first time all day, Eleanor didn't feel powerless. The betrayal was still raw, but underneath it pulsed a sharper instinct. To act, to take back some control over the narrative that was being written without her consent. She didn't know exactly what form that would take yet, but she knew one thing for certain: She would not let herself be an invisible casualty in someone else's celebration. She spent the next hour moving slowly through her home, her thoughts punctuated by the ordinary sounds of the house, settling for the evening. The ticking of the clock, the low hum of the refrigerator. But the normal rhythm of her life felt different now, as if each familiar sound was an anchor holding her steady while she contemplated a storm. She walked into her bedroom, opened her wardrobe, and let her fingers drift across the garments inside. There was her emerald green gown, the one she had worn only once to a charity event years ago. It still looked striking, still made her stand taller when she slipped it on. She imagined walking into a room full of glittering lights, imagined the shocked expressions on faces that had believed her absent. She imagined her daughter's eyes meeting hers across a sea of strangers. That vision, sharp and vivid, sent a small thrill through her. It wasn't cruelty she wanted, it was acknowledgement. She wanted to be seen, to remind the people who had dismissed her that she was still here, still someone. The street outside grew darker, and the cold pressed more firmly against the windows. Eleanor turned on a lamp, its warm glow casting her reflection faintly in the glass. She looked at herself for a long moment, studying the woman who stared back. 60 years of life showed in her eyes, in the lines that traced stories across her face. But there was also something ageless there, a quiet, stubborn spark that had survived disappointments and heartbreaks before. By the time she set the invitation back down, she knew the rest of the day would not pass as she had originally planned. She wouldn't be sitting at home while her daughter's world turned without her. And though she didn't yet have the full plan, the decision was already made somewhere deep inside her. The gala, the hall, the golden light, it would not proceed without Eleanor, Whitmore's shadow falling across it in some way. She stepped away from the table, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. The night ahead might be long, and it might be complicated, but for the first time since the morning, she felt alive with possibility. Whatever happened next, it would not be silence. It would not be invisibility. It would be hers. And Eleanor spent the rest of the evening pacing her living room, her thoughts looping in steady, deliberate circles. The decision to act had already been made somewhere deep inside her. Now it was a matter of shaping that impulse into something tangible. She could feel the weight of the invitation in her mind, its gold lettering as vivid as if it were still sitting on the table in front of her. She thought of the gleaming chandeliers at the Grand Orchid Hall, the polished marble floors, the well-dressed guests arriving in expensive cars. Every image came with the same bitter truth. Sabrina had wanted her nowhere near it. She sat down at her writing desk, pulling out her old address book again. Her fingers flipped past familiar names, some crossed out with time, others marked with small notes about changes in address. It had been years since she'd called many of these people, but the thought of them made her smile. Friends from her library days, people she had served alongside at charity drives, even a few former neighbors who had moved away, but still sent Christmas cards. As she moved through the pages, one name made her pause, Howard Drake. Howard's name was written in her neat, careful hand, his number recorded twice. Once for his office, once for his personal line. She remembered vividly the first time she had met him, when he had been a struggling entrepreneur with little more than determination and an idea. His small startup had been on the verge of collapsing under paperwork errors and contractual confusion, and Eleanor, with her meticulous eye for detail, had stepped in to help him sort it all out. She had worked through the night, going line by line over legal documents until they were flawless. Howard had been grateful beyond words, promising her that if she ever needed help, he would make himself available, without question, without delay. Over the years, they had stayed in touch, just enough for the promise to remain unbroken. Without allowing herself to overthink, she picked up the phone and dialed his personal number. The line rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. Eleanor. Goodness, it's been a long time. As she smiled despite herself. Too long, Howard. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time? For you? Never. What's going on? His tone shifted slightly, a blend of curiosity and concern. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then told him everything. Her 60th birthday, the silence from her daughter, the discovery that she had been blocked, the gala at the Grand Orchard Hall, and the invitation that had come into her hands only because Margaret had decided to be honest. She didn't embellish, but she didn't soften the edges either. By the time she finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line, heavy and thoughtful. That's unacceptable, Howard said finally, his voice low. Tell me, this gala, you said it's tonight? Yes, 7 o'clock. And the hall, is it a private booking? I believe so. Sabrina's husband's family name was on the invitation. Another pause, this one longer. She could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. Then his voice returned, sharp and decisive. Eleanor, do you know how venue contracts work? Only vaguely. Well, many of them, especially high-end places, allow for what's called a buyout. If someone offers a certain amount, they can override an existing booking, provided the event hasn't started and the original hosts are compensated. It's a matter of money and timing, and you've just called me with both in your favor. Eleanor's heart gave a strange, almost startled beat. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, he interrupted gently, that we make this evening one you'll never forget. How much do you think your dignity is worth, Eleanor? Because if you leave this to pass quietly, you'll be carrying the weight of it for years. But if you act now, well, let's just say, Sabrina will learn something she won't forget either. The thought felt almost unreal, but it also carried a certain intoxicating clarity. And the cost, she asked carefully, between what you've got saved and what I'm willing to put in. Covered, he said without hesitation. I owe you far more than this. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse his money, but something inside her stopped her. Pride was important, yes, but she realized this wasn't about owing or being owed. This was about reclaiming something that had been taken from her, about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. All right, she said finally. What do we do? Howard wasted no time. He asked her to gather every detail she had from the invitation, then told her he would call the hall directly. Within 20 minutes, he called back, his tone triumphant. It's done. The Grand Orchard Hall is yours for the evening. The original booking has been canceled, payment settled. You can have it starting at 6 p.m. sharp. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the enormity of what had just happened washing over her. Howard, I don't know what to say. Say you'll enjoy your birthday, Eleanor, he replied. Now, you'll need guests. And you'll need to be ready to walk in there like you own the place, which you will. After they hung up, Eleanor moved quickly. She began calling people from her address book, her voice warm but threaded with urgency. Old friends answered with surprise and delight. Some couldn't believe they were hearing from her after so many years, and even fewer could believe they were being invited to a last-minute celebration at such an illustrious venue. But they didn't hesitate. One by one, they promised to be there, some even offering to bring friends or small gifts. As the calls went on, Eleanor felt herself changing. The heaviness of the morning, the hollow ache of being blocked, began to lift. In its place came a quiet strength, a steadiness she had almost forgotten she possessed. She wasn't just planning to attend this evening, she was shaping it. She thought of the emerald gown in her wardrobe, the one that had waited years for an occasion worthy of it. Tonight, it would finally have its moment. By the time the clock struck 5, Her bedroom had become a flurry of preparation. She stood before the mirror, carefully applying makeup, her hand steady despite the swirl of adrenaline beneath her calm exterior. She pinned her silver hair into an elegant twist, letting a few soft strands frame her face. The emerald gown slipped over her shoulders like an embrace, its deep color making her skin glow. She added a single string of pearls, a gift from her late mother, and small diamond earrings that had been her first purchase after years of thrift. Oliver sat on the bed, watching her with an unblinking gaze, as if he understood that something unusual was about to happen. She gave him a soft pat on the head before stepping into her black heels and collecting her clutch. The drive to the Grand Orchard Hall felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The streets were lined with winter lights, small bursts of gold and white against the fading sky. As she approached the venue, she saw the soft glow of chandeliers spilling through the tall windows, the marble steps leading to grand double doors. A valet hurried forward to open her car door, addressing her as Madame Whitmore, with a respectful nod. Inside, the hall was every bit as magnificent as she remembered from brochures and stories. A high domed ceiling, crystal chandeliers, and tables draped in ivory linen. Staff moved with quiet efficiency, setting out champagne flutes and arranging floral centerpieces. It was hers now for this one night, and she intended to make every moment count. Her guests began arriving soon after. Old friends embraced her warmly, their faces lighting up at the sight of the venue. Some brought small gifts wrapped in silver paper. Others simply came with open hearts and ready laughter. The air filled quickly with conversation and the sound of glasses clinking. Eleanor greeted each person with genuine joy, moving gracefully from one group to another. As she stood near the entrance, she imagined the moment Sabrina would arrive, expecting to host her own grand celebration, only to find herself shut out. The thought no longer brought her the raw sting of betrayal. It brought a sense of balance, as though the scales had finally tipped back in her favor. By 6:30, the hall was alive with music, the band playing soft jazz in the background. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Eleanor took a moment to stand at the edge of the room, watching her guests laugh and mingle under the warm light. She realized that tonight wasn't just about showing Sabrina she couldn't be erased. It was about reminding herself that she was still surrounded by people who valued her, who saw her worth without condition. Somewhere beyond those marble steps, Sabrina and her in-laws were no doubt receiving the news from the venue manager that their event had been canceled. Eleanor could almost picture her daughter's disbelief, the rising panic, the questions. She didn't dwell on it too long. Tonight was hers, and she would savor it without letting bitterness steal its sweetness. When Howard arrived, dapper in a tailored suit, she greeted him with a hug that spoke volumes. "You've outdone yourself," she told him. "No," he said with a smile. "You've outdone yourself. I just gave you the stage." The two of them clinked glasses, the golden champagne catching the light. Eleanor felt the weight of the day lift completely, replaced by something freer, lighter. She had taken the hurt that had been handed to her that morning and transformed it into an evening that would be remembered. Not as the day she was forgotten, but as the night she reclaimed her place. And as the band played on, and her guests filled the hall with warmth and laughter, Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she would never again wait quietly for someone else to decide her worth. Eleanor stood near the entrance of the Grand Orchard Hall, the heavy double doors just a few feet behind her, the polished marble beneath her heels gleaming like still water. The chandeliers above sent warm golden light, cascading over the entire room, and the hum of conversation blended with the smooth notes of the live jazz band playing in the corner. Her emerald gown caught the light every time she moved, its deep green folds whispering softly against the floor. The place was hers, completely hers, and yet she knew the true moment she had been waiting for was still to come. Somewhere beyond those doors, the people who had tried to erase her from her own life story were on their way, expecting a stage that was no longer theirs. She scanned the room for Howard, who was speaking animatedly with a small circle of her guests near one of the tall floral arrangements. He caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod, a reassurance that everything was unfolding as planned. Waiters glided between tables with practiced ease, topping up champagne flutes, offering trays of canapes. Laughter rippled through the air in gentle waves. Eleanor moved among her guests with an ease that belied the storm she knew was gathering outside, greeting each person warmly, thanking them for coming, and exchanging memories that reached back years. At precisely 7 o'clock, the ornate brass handles of the main doors began to turn. The air shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the room itself sensed what was about to happen. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped in first, followed closely by Sabrina and her husband, Julian. Behind them, a cluster of immaculately dressed guests began to file in, their faces bright with the anticipation of an evening of grandeur. Eleanor did not move from her place. She watched, her expression calm, as Sabrina's eyes swept the room, taking in the crowded tables, the glowing chandeliers, the music, the familiar faces she hadn't seen in years. The confusion that flickered across her face was brief, but unmistakable. It was Julian who spoke first, his voice edged with a sharp disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded, his gaze moving to the event manager, who hovered nervously by the entrance. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne," the manager said, his tone polite but firm. "This venue is booked for a private event hosted by Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. You and your party are not on the guest list." Sabrina's head snapped back toward the manager, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of several guests. "This is my mother. She has no business." Eleanor cut her off, her tone measured and steady. "No business. Sabrina, this is my 60th birthday. The hall is mine tonight. You'll have to take your party elsewhere." A flush crept up Sabrina's cheeks, the kind that came from more than just embarrassment. It was the sting of being caught off guard in a place she thought she controlled. The guests who had followed her and now stood awkwardly, glancing between the two women as if trying to gauge the safest path forward. Julian's jaw tightened. "We paid for this venue." "And you were compensated for the cancellation," Eleanor replied evenly, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "The management was clear with you, I'm sure." There was a long, taut silence. For a moment, Eleanor thought Sabrina might lash out, say something designed to wound her further. But instead, Sabrina's gaze shifted away, focusing on the people in the room who were watching with barely concealed curiosity. Without another word, she turned sharply on her heel, murmuring something to Julian. Together, they ushered their bewildered guests back toward the doors. As the heavy doors closed behind them, a subtle wave of relief swept over Eleanor, not because she had driven them out. That wasn't the victory she sought, but because she had reclaimed something that had been slipping away from her for years, her right to stand in her own life without being made invisible. Howard appeared at her side, his expression unreadable, but his eyes glinting with a hint of approval. "Well," he said softly, "that was decisive." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. It was necessary. The band, sensing the moment had passed, swelled into a livelier tune. Conversations resumed, but there was an added brightness in the air now, a shared sense among her guests that they had just witnessed something rare. A quiet act of defiance that spoke louder than anger ever could. She moved toward the center of the room, where a small stage had been set up for speeches. Taking the microphone from its stand, she tapped it gently, drawing the room's attention. The band lowered their volume to a gentle background hum. "Friends," she began, her voice clear, steady, and warm. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. Some of us have known each other for decades, others for only a few years. But what matters is that you chose to share this evening with me." She paused, scanning the room. 60 years of life teach you many things: patience, resilience, the value of kindness. But they also teach you that sometimes you must take a stand for yourself. Not because you wish to hurt anyone, but because you must remind yourself and others that you are still here, still worth seeing. There was a ripple of applause, soft at first, then growing. Eleanor let it fade before continuing. "Tonight, I choose not to dwell on those who could not be here. Instead, I choose to celebrate the people who are here, those who have stood by me through the years, who have shared laughter, work, and the ordinary moments that stitch together a life." She lifted her glass, which a waiter had placed in her hand just moments before. "To friendship, to dignity, and to never letting anyone else decide your worth." The room erupted in warm applause, and the sound filled every corner of the hall. Glasses clinked, and guests smiled at one another with a sense of shared pride in being part of this night. Eleanor stepped down from the stage, the weight in her chest replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Howard caught her arm gently as she passed. "You've just rewritten your own story," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, her smile widening. "But I think I've also just started a new one." The rest of the evening unfolded like a well-crafted symphony. The band shifted into upbeat numbers. Couples took to the floor to dance, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh roses and polished wood. Eleanor moved through it all like a hostess born for the role, laughing, listening, and soaking in the warmth of genuine companionship. From time to time, her mind flickered back to the moment at the doors, the look on Sabrina's face, the tightness in Julian's voice, but it no longer carried the sting it had earlier in the day. That part of the story was over. What mattered now was the joy radiating from the people around her, the knowledge that she had refused to be erased, and the quiet satisfaction of having done it with elegance rather than cruelty. As the night deepened, the crowd began to thin, some guests departing with hugs and promises to meet again soon. The final hour of the evening was quieter, filled with the comfortable murmur of those who remained. Eleanor stood once more near the entrance, this time not waiting for anyone to arrive, but simply watching the room she had filled with light and laughter. Howard joined her again, carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of champagne. "For the drive home," he said with a wink. She accepted it gratefully. "You know, I didn't realize how much I needed tonight until it was happening. That's how the best nights work," he replied. They remind you of the parts of yourself you thought were gone. They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee, watching the last of the guests linger over dessert. And when the band finally played their closing number, Eleanor felt no sadness that the night was ending, only a deep, abiding sense of peace. When she finally stepped out into the crisp night air, the stars above were sharp and bright against the dark sky. The hall's golden lights spilled onto the marble steps, casting her shadow long and strong before her. She paused for a moment, breathing in the cold, clean air, and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had walked into the day expecting nothing but loneliness and left it with a memory that would burn brighter than any candle on any cake. She had proven to herself that no matter how others tried to diminish her place in their story, she could always take back the pen and write her own chapter. And that, she knew, was the sweetest victory of all. The last of the laughter was still echoing softly in Eleanor's ears when the band packed away their instruments and the final trays of untouched canapes were carried back toward the kitchen. The hall was quieter now, but still warm with the lingering energy of the evening. The scent of roses, champagne, and polished wood floated faintly in the air. Some of the guests had gone, carrying with them the afterglow of a night that would be remembered for its elegance and its unexpected story. Others remained, sipping coffee and exchanging soft conversation at the tables that had been so full just hours earlier. Eleanor stood at the far end of the room, her gaze sweeping over every detail, the glint of light off the crystal chandeliers, the ivory linens now creased with the signs of good company, the half-drained glasses left behind by those who had toasted her. Howard was still there, of course, seated comfortably at a corner table with two of her friends from the library days. He had a way of fitting into any room, his smile genuine, his presence steady. When he caught her eye, he lifted his glass slightly, as if to remind her of the promise she had made earlier, to end the night with a toast that would be remembered. Eleanor nodded back, feeling the weight of that moment settle into her. She stepped toward the center of the room, heels clicking softly on the marble. A few heads turned, conversations trailing off as they noticed her movement. She didn't hurry. Instead, she allowed the stillness to gather naturally. A waiter, sensing her intent, appeared at her side with a fresh flute of champagne. She took it with a murmured thanks, the bubbles rising in a graceful stream. When she reached the center, she paused, letting her gaze rest on the faces before her. There were people she had known for decades, people she had reconnected with only that evening, and even a few she had just met, friends of friends who had come out of curiosity or kindness. Each one, in their own way, had made the choice to stand in her corner on a night when she could have been standing alone. That truth filled her chest with something warm and unshakable. She raised her glass slowly, allowing the motion to draw every last bit of attention to her. The room quieted completely, even the faint clink of cutlery from the kitchen fading away. She could feel the smooth stem of the glass in her hand, the gentle tremor of anticipation running through her fingers. When she spoke, her voice carried with a clarity that came from more than volume. It came from the absolute certainty of her words. To the people in this room, she began, her tone rich and steady, and to the people who could not be here. Tonight has been many things for me. Unexpected, emotional, even a little surreal. This morning, I woke up thinking I would spend my birthday alone. That's the truth. I thought the day would pass without celebration, without even acknowledgement from some of the people I once believed would always be by my side. A small murmur moved through the crowd, not in judgment, but in understanding. But life, she continued, has a way of reminding us that we are never as alone as we think. Sometimes, the people who see your worth most clearly are not the ones you share blood with, but the ones who choose to stand beside you anyway. Family can be chosen just as much as it can be inherited. And tonight, looking around this room, I see my family. She let her gaze move deliberately from one side of the room to the other, catching the eyes of old friends, neighbors, colleagues. We live in a world where it is too easy to let others decide our value. Too easy to stay quiet when we are pushed aside. Too easy to convince ourselves that being overlooked means we are undeserving. But we are none of those things. Every person here tonight matters, not because someone else says so, but because we decide it ourselves. The words hung in the air, not rushed, not dramatic, but solid, like stones placed carefully to build something lasting. I want to thank you, she said, her voice softening. Not just for being here tonight, but for every time you've answered a phone call, offered a kind word, or simply remembered that I exist. Those things matter more than we often admit. And I hope, in some small way, this evening reminds each of you of your own worth, too. She glanced down at her glass for a brief moment, watching the bubbles swirl before looking back up. There are people who will try to write you out of their story. They will pretend you don't matter or that you can be replaced. But the truth is, your story belongs to you, and you have the right to write every chapter yourself. She took a breath, letting the truth of that statement settle into the quiet. So tonight, I raise my glass to self-worth, to dignity, to knowing that our value is not measured by someone else's approval, and to the courage it takes to stand up and say, I am still here. There was a pause, just long enough for the words to sink in before the room erupted into warm applause. Glasses lifted in unison, the sound of clinking crystal ringing clear and bright beneath the chandeliers. Eleanor drank the champagne crisp and cool, the moment sweeter than any she had tasted in years. Howard was the first to reach her when she stepped down from the small rise where she'd spoken. He didn't say much, just clasped her hand and gave it a firm squeeze. That, she thought, was enough. The rest of the evening slipped into a kind of golden haze. Guests lingered in small groups, reluctant to break the spell of the night. Eleanor moved among them, accepting hugs, hearing quiet words of admiration, and promising to keep in touch. A few people admitted they had been hesitant to come on such short notice, but now they were glad they had. Nights like this don't come along often, one woman told her. By the time the final guests left, the hall was nearly empty. The staff moved quietly, clearing tables and collecting linens, but even they seemed to move with a certain gentleness, as if they understood the significance of what had happened there. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the room for a moment, looking up at the chandeliers. The light from them bathed her in gold, and for the first time in a long while, she felt entirely herself, whole, unshaken, unhidden. Howard appeared again, his coat over his arm. Ready, he asked. She smiled, a deep, content smile. Yes. They walked together to the main doors, and as Eleanor stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapped around her like a promise. The city was quiet at this hour, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. She paused at the top of the marble steps, turning back to look at the grand hall one last time. The glow from inside spilled out onto the steps, lighting the place where she stood. It felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. She thought briefly of Sabrina, not with bitterness, but with a calm certainty that she had reclaimed something far more important than an invitation to a party. She had reclaimed her narrative, her voice, and the unshakable knowledge that she would never again wait passively for acknowledgement. If the world tried to shut a door on her, she now knew she had the strength to open it herself, or buy the entire building if she chose. Howard held the car door for her, and as she settled into the seat, she glanced once more at the hall. You know, she said, fastening her seatbelt, this might have been the best birthday of my life. He laughed softly. I think it's the first of many more you'll remember this way. They drove through the quiet streets, the golden glow of the hall fading into the distance. Eleanor leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting briefly to the stars that dotted the sky. The night had been hers, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. And that, she realized, was the true victory. When she finally returned home, the house felt different. Warmer, lighter, as if it too had been changed by the night's events. Oliver padded into the hallway to greet her, winding himself around her ankles. She bent to scoop him into her arms, pressing her cheek to his soft fur. We did it, Ollie, she murmured. We really did? She placed the champagne flute she'd brought home on the mantel, not as a keepsake of the party itself, but as a reminder, a physical marker of the night she chose herself over silence, dignity over erasure. And as she turned out the lights and made her way to bed, she knew she would sleep without the heaviness that had greeted her that morning. She had entered the day expecting to be forgotten. She ended it celebrated, surrounded, and utterly unshakable. And that was the kind of ending she intended to write for every chapter of her life from now on.